All right, we've been looking at the nature, character of God. And last week we looked at his love slash mercy. Right? And before I tell you what we're looking at tonight, I think most of you already know, but what's the opposite of love? Hatred. Anger. Indifference. I personally am going to go with Rita. The opposite of love, oftentimes we think of it as anger, right? But that's certainly not true. Now, hatred, you could make a strong argument for hatred. But we've been upset with angry with our spouses, with our children, with all kinds of people in relationship. Do you normally get really angry with people you don't love? Or let me put it this way, who gets under your skin the most? Amanda, can you tell us? The people we love, right? Get under our skin the most because we love, right? Now, hatred, like I said, Mike, I'd go with indifference, but I think there's a great argument for hatred as well. We're going to look tonight at God's wrath slash justice. And I stated this last week that I don't believe we can understand his wrath until we understand his love. In fact, I think his wrath is a display of his love and connected very close to the need for justice. So we've been going to some New Testament verses each week and kind of looking at them at the beginning and then at the end coming back to them in light of what we've looked at. So I want to continue that. If you would turn to Matthew 5. Someone tell me what we find in Matthew 5. The Beatitudes, that's absolutely correct. I want to look at two of these Beatitudes, and really I think all the Beatitudes would play into this. But I heard an idea here months ago that's interesting to me, and I don't think it's a conclusive one or the other. But we normally look at the Beatitudes as what we are aiming to be. And I looked at a scholar that said that the Beatitudes were not Jesus saying, here's what you want to be, but rather saying, here's what my kingdom's going to look like. Here's the people who are going to make up who my kingdom is. And with that idea in mind, I want you to look at verse 4 and verse 6. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed, verse 6, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. We're going to come back to those, and normally we're talking about the Beatitudes as goals. We're saying, we need to be mournful at the right things, right? Be mournful at sin. When we talk about righteousness, hunger and thirsting for righteousness, we talk about, wanting to do right, wanting to know more, wanting to do right. We're going to look at those. I think those absolutely apply, but we're going to add a little bit more to that, hopefully, at the end of tonight's lesson. Let's turn over to one more New Testament verse before we go back to Exodus. It's in Hebrews. Now, when we looked at the idea of God's holiness, and we went to Hebrews 12. Tonight I want to go to Hebrews 10. And we looked at when the Hebrew writer in chapter 12, verse 29, says that God is a consuming fire. Remember, we looked at that in the Old Testament context and realized, why, that's saying really the exact opposite of usually what we mean it to be saying. I half, though, expected someone to say, hey, what about Hebrews 10 and the passage from 26 through 31? And no one did, which is all right. But tonight we're going to look at that side of it, because I think this is oftentimes what we're thinking of when we quote that verse from chapter 12, that God's a consuming fire. In fact, earlier, we see that, well, let's look at verse 31, as I said. I'll find it here. It is in my Bible somewhere. There it is. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God. Now, I think usually, as I said before, we connect that and say, well, that's because he's consuming fire. We noted, though, that consuming fire is used extensively to refer to the fact that God was going to extinguish the enemy. It was there in chapter 12 is a source of encouragement for us. But here, this is a stern warning. There is nothing about this passage that's meant to be solely encouragement. It's meant to be a warning. Right? It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Why is that? Okay, so am I hearing the concept of judgment? Bob, you're talking, okay, absolutely, judgment. Emily?
I was going to say, if you're doing something wrong, he's going to be very upset.
Okay, so upset, am I hearing, excuse me. Yeah, I turned it off on purpose. Thank you. So Pam gave me a piece of cinnamon hard candy, and it wasn't quite done by the time it went, and it just slid down my throat. So that cough was Pam's fault. So Emily, you said upset. I'm hearing anger and wrath there. Right? We're just talking about upset's mouth. Okay. We were talking about Bill's recovery. I never saw, I'm sure David saw Bill's anger. I figured David knew what that looked like. I only saw him angry once, and it was more agitated. I went to PCC with the Barons as a pre-camper. And I don't remember all the reasoning, but I flattened a kid's tires. There, another pre-camper on his bicycle. And I know, you gave me plenty of flack then. I don't have, this is going back a long time. She's going to get back after me again. And I saw a little bit of Bill's anger, because I don't think Bill would have been normally disturbed by that at all, other than he had to drive into town to find an air pump with me. And I can still remember coming up out of there and Bill just growling as he's driving. Look what you've done. We've got to go clear into town, which those of you that have been to Blue Knob understand that what going into town means. So I was fearful, right? And, that was the most of Bill's anger I'd ever saw. And he was just growling. That was it. But the idea of anger and wrath, right? The reason it's fearful to fall into the hands of a living God is because he's powerful, right? In fact, we're going to look at a passage that says this.
But if you're not doing anything wrong, it's not, right?
Okay, so that to me is even more fearful, if I'm open and honest. So Emily says, if you're not doing anything wrong, it's not fearful. But who does that apply to? No one, right? And so that gets really scary, doesn't it? And then that kind of sends us down this path that I suggested a few weeks ago as we were studying about God's holiness and then God's mercy, that I oftentimes pictured God as reluctantly forgiving, right? He should be angry with me. He wants to be angry with me, but maybe he might forgive me. I'm not doing too much wrong, because I know I'm doing some wrong, right? Now, what I want to do tonight, as we go throughout the same, what I think Scripture does, is shows us where this love and this wrath are not opposed to each other. Because love and wrath can be opposed to each other, can't they? We'll come back to Rita's idea eventually. I wanted to plant that seed. That indifference is the lack of love, the opposite of love. But they aren't diametrical to each other. In fact, wrath is the natural result of love. And for those who are God's, belong to God, is not something to be feared, but rather appreciated. Now, if we're using that word fear in the sense of reverence and awe, that's a different story. But I mean fearful as though it's going to turn on us. How many of you have ever felt sometimes that God is this mercurial or this go from mood swing to mood swing type of being? Happy one moment, not so much the next. I certainly have. Everyone, some are saying no, some are like, I have. I mean, who else brings a nation out of Egypt, out into the wilderness and starts striking them dead, opening up the earth to gobble them up? You know, he loved them then. Now all of a sudden he's hot. He's angry. What did they? Well, that now, yeah. Now we're back to where Emily was, right? What they do?
Yeah, what they do. They got to cause some kind of grief, or he wouldn't just be showing his wrath to them.
Yeah.
So obviously they're at fault.
Yeah, well, it's God. They have to be at fault, right? But it does impact how we look at God, doesn't it? If you ever, this was not my father. My father was like really, really patient until he snaps. Right? And then he makes up for, time. But you know that picture of the father who is like totally intolerant in the slightest little thing. I left a shoe out in the middle of the floor, and man, he's giving this child a severe abusive beating, right? We've seen that imagery, right? And sometimes God takes on that, is painted like that. Like this, he's mercurial. He's going to go from 0 to 100, nothing flat, because you did something wrong. Well, how wrong does it have to be? That's why I think we're going to look at tonight. Let's come back to Exodus 34. Because I've thrown some questions out there, right? Let's get some of these answers, and then we'll get some input as we go along. But start to bring some of these ideas full circle. We've been coming back to Exodus 34. I don't know a better passage to look at the nature of God than God himself saying, here's who I am, right? And starting in verse 6, the Lord passed before him, being Moses, and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious. We looked at that a couple weeks ago. Slow to anger. Does God have anger? Absolutely. What's the difference between anger and wrath?
Anger, you don't usually act on it. Wrath, you act on it.
Exactly. Wrath is the action of anger, right? Anger is emotion. Wrath is the enactment, the fulfillment of that. There's probably more, I know there's more scientific definitions or precise definitions, but those are my layman definitions. Slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands and forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. Now, we could look at a lot of details of that last part, but I want to focus in on by no means will clear the guilty. We're talking about justice there, are we not? Yeah, that's justice. Now, we're going to look at wrath and justice tonight. Come back, if you would, to the anger. Notice that anger is not a part of God that's kind of put out there contrary to love. In fact, his anger is part of the description of that love. Merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. The fact that he's slow to anger is because he's abounding in love. But I think we already saw that it wouldn't be right to never be angry if we loved, right? To never have anger. Let's come back, if you would, to the New Testament. Hang on, I'm getting in front of myself a second. You can turn to the New Testament if you want, but I'm not going to tell you where just yet. Oftentimes, the God of the Old Testament is painted as intolerant, right? Strike people dead, and the God in the New Testament is much more loving. I believe it was over 500 times the wrath of God or anger of God, or descriptions similar to that, are spoken about in the Old Testament. That's a lot, right? We're going to talk about God. We can't skip over his wrath.
In Hosea it says, gave thee a king in my anger and took him away in my wrath.
Ah, yeah. Huh. That's an interesting usage of both of those words, isn't it? Is that parallelism to build? It definitely, upon just glance, shows that God has both of those, right, Jerry? We could dissect that difference a little bit, but that's it. I'm glad you shared that. I think this is going to show, that illustrates where I'm going with this even more. I gave you a king in my anger and took him away in my wrath. When you know the history of Israel, that means a lot, right? Do you know, and I encourage you to look these up, the challenges with looking at the nature of God is refine this down to what we can do in one night study. It's not the lack of material. Look up in the Concordance or Google, slow to anger Old Testament. My point is, even in the Old Testament, God's anger is described as slow. not this reactive, snap, reaction type of God that just, like Mike said, what did they do? Speaking of the Israelites, we're going to see it's never just an innocent act or a mistake. What did they do? That's a really good question, right? So we're going to look at that. But God was slow to anger over and over and over again. Let's come back now with that idea to Romans, the first chapter. Most of you here can quote verse 16 for me, right? Romans 1:16. Dave, we have to give Sharon a tardy slip, but she made it. See, good to have you, Sharon. All right, Romans 1:16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. Now we're going to have a couple of statements that, at least in my mind, are a description of parts of the gospel. Right? Verse 17. For in it, in what? In the gospel, right? In the gospel, or to quote, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. Now, verse 18. It's a new paragraph, but aren't we still talking about the gospel? For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Is wrath of God part of the good news? Is the wrath of God part of the good news?
Care of those who don't obey.
Ah, yeah. Ernie, I think, nailed it. Yes. Because nothing can be good with those who are evil around, right? Gary's telling me the other day, basketball coach was really on him for teeing a kid up, right? No one likes to get a tee, do they, Gary? How many players, let me take it here, how many coaches would like to play a basketball game with no referees?
I would think none.
It would be absurd to think there's any, right? It wouldn't be a game, would it? It would be dangerous, right? No rules. It would be horrible. Now, what's interesting, no one likes skid T, a technical. No one likes a call on them. Evie said to me the other day, or back when she was playing, said, that girl shoved me and there was no call. She was talking about in the fourth quarter of the game. I said, Evie, what about in the first quarter when the ball was loose and you were crossing half court and you were both reaching for the ball and your hand went square in the middle of her back and then extended and the poor girl placed her face on the court? What about that no call? Because there was no whistle on it. I was shocked. Well, she wasn't complaining about that no call, right? Here's the point. Let me bring this out, and then we'll attempt to see it in Scripture. The wrath of God is because He loves. When we understand what Satan did, and what Adam and what Eve did in chapter 3 of Genesis, because that leads, as well as the second rebellion, Genesis 6, to all the awfulness that we see today. Should He not be angry? What about, how many of you are angry about what's going on in Ukraine? You know, heads are going. You should be angry, right? You should.
In those big cities, the nice cities too, you know, it'd be just like a tank coming down through Brookville, blowing the courthouse up and shooting the buildings, you know.
Yeah.
I just can't fathom it.
Yeah, it's crazy. You'd be really mad if it was home, right? Mm-hmm. You want to talk to Dad and tell me he should be in Bible study. Yeah, I mean, someone destroys what's you love, you're going to be angry, right? Look at verse 18 again. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. And then we go on, this whole chapter is a description of that till verse 32. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval for those that practice them. You know what amazes me? You hear two extremes. You hear people say about this judgmental, wrathful God, how could you worship a God that created hell? And then the very same people will say about a pedophile or someone really, really repulsive sin, well, they have a special place waiting for them in hell. You've heard that, right? Now, which is it? Now, I'm using extremes on both sides. The point is, we all want justice, right? We all, well, not for ourselves, except for ourselves, right? We all want to see those radical people get justice. We just don't want it for me. Just don't want it for me. Look, if you would, at Psalm 82. Now think about, as you're turning there to Psalm 82, about what Rita said about the opposite of love being the indifference. One of the things that I just never knew, as I'm reading more and more in the prophets, it just jumps out at me more and more. You know, the prophets are what I knew very well for a long time, is God saying, Israel, I'm done with you, I'm fed up with you, I'm going to punish you. But what I've missed most of my life throughout those prophets is that it is God saying, you are perverting justice, you are oppressing the poor, you are taking advantage of the helpless. I've had it with you. I'm not going to let this go forever. That idea of justice, right? Look at Psalm 82. Starting in verse 1, it's a short psalm. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. Now, here's the appeal to God, to Almighty. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Now, this is, excuse me, I said that wrong. This, I believe, is God saying to the rest on the council, as we're going to see, to the other rulers. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Now, it is very possible that God's talking to the rulers of the nations, right? We talked about anger over Ukraine. Verse 3, give justice to the weak, and the fatherless maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. So the picture here is God sitting in the council saying, how long are you going to let this go on? Quit it. Mankind is walking in darkness because of this. Verse 6, I said, you are God, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. The psalm is an appeal to God to set right what is wrong, for justice. You see, we cannot appall the wrath of God, the justice of God, unless we give up all morality. And if we give up all morality, and Mike's not going to take this position. Did you drive your truck tonight, Mike? No. That sure takes a stick out of this example. Well, you'll see. Kevin, do you drive your truck? Yeah. All right. Kevin's got a nice truck. It's not as new as Mike's, right? But it's a nice truck. So Kevin says, hey, I can't, this wrath of God, it's no good. He can't be upset with me when I go out and take the keys to his truck and take it to my house, right? Steal it. Why? Because that's a just wrath, right? It's morality. It's wrong for me to take his truck. Well, I'm not big enough to do that, right? Now, I think when we come throughout Genesis, and we understand what Genesis 3 brings in, I think we start to understand why God is wrathful. It's not his default position. He's not this angry character, right? Genesis 6, 5 through 8. The imaginations of man are only continually evil. I've oftentimes used the example. We've driven through small sections of big cities that were like that and are uncomfortable just going through them. Now imagine if that's your neighborhood and you can't get away from it. Wouldn't you want a God that's wrathful, that's bothered by that? We want to talk about him destroying the earth, but we can't talk about that without also talking about the fact he recreated it. A better place. That's what the decreation was about, to recreate. Now, questions or comments so far? Because I put a lot of ideas out there. There's one very significant point I still want to get out yet to bring this full circle. But any questions or comments before we go further? No.
Isn't God slow to wrath now? Because look at all the evil, and he's still not calling it over.
Yeah. So Emily's saying, if I'm hearing you right, it's obvious God's slow to wrath. I mean, look at what's going on. He's still not acting, right? Directly, in a sense. Yeah, absolutely. And then we can, that's a macro view. We can take out more of a micro view and look at my own life, right? Too short. Now, but here's the problem. Here's where I want to go with this. Last point. You see, when it comes to my life, I'm really not that bad. How do I know I'm not that bad? Because a lot of you all are way worse than I am. Well, maybe not you all, but there's people that are way worse than I am, right? It's not very hard for us to name someone who's a worse criminal than myself. Aha. Sometimes legitimately, because there is very much more harmful sins and crimes than I've ever committed out there. But then the other part of that is the self-justification. You see, when I step on the person's foot in the McDonald's line, I don't know why any of us would wait in line for McDonald's, but that's a side point. It's justified. He was in my space, right? I can justify it. I can make it right. Here's why I want to go back in our remaining time and look at. The wrath of God is against the rebellious. Chapter 3 is a rebellion. It's certainly a rebellion by Satan, right? And I believe it's a rebellion by Adam and Eve. They want to become like God. And look, they destroy everything in the process. Chapter 6. We see it's a little harder to explain, understand the details there. But chapter 6 is a rebellion against God. That's where we have the destruction. Let's go to the Exodus, Mike. We don't have time reading through the book of Exodus. I encourage you to do so. All these people he's striking dead are not because they've made a mistake. They're rebellion. I've had it with you, God. I'm going to have it my way. And God cannot form his nation while that's what's taken place. He's nurturing the same thing as in the flood. The decreation is a necessary part of the recreation to make something valuable. I think this is maybe the strongest illustration of that as you turn to Hebrews 10 again. Would heaven be heaven if you're lodged next to an axe murderer? Have keep your door locked. What if your neighbor is a kleptomaniac and is going to steal all your golden bricks out of your side of the pavement? Right? Heaven's not heaven if the rebellious are still rebellious. Now, here's the final point for you and I as Christians. What we need to fear is being rebellious. You know, we talk about the grace of God, and you say, oh, does that mean I can do anything? And Paul deals with that. You missed the whole point. When you want to be like that, the anger of God's not for those who sin, who make mistakes. It's for those who embrace. John uses the word practice in the ESV. The concepts there in the original language of embracing and practicing it. Something you practice is something you want to become better at, right? Hebrews 10, this passage we read about being a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Look at verse 26. For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. He's saying if you sin deliberately after knowing what Jesus did for you, you're rebellious, is the bottom line. That's not what the Hebrew writer's saying. That's what he's saying. How much worse, he talks about in 27, 28, the law of Moses. 29, though, how much worse punishment do you think will be deserved by the one who has trampled underfoot the Son of God, who has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has outraged the Spirit of grace? Vengeance is mine, for we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. What kind of God would we serve if we willingly trample underfoot the blood of Jesus? He's not bothered by it. Wow. You see, I think his love explains his wrath, as well as his justice in our place to it. We do not serve mercurial God, an angry God who's looking to snap us at a moment's notice. We serve a loving God who's just, who wants us on his side, who's done everything he can to persuade us to that side. May it be our aim to return that love with true and appropriate love, obedience, and submission of life. Thank you. Oh, I can't end just yet. So Matthew 6, 4 and 6, right? Or Matthew 5, 4 and 6. Blessed are those who mourn. When we look around us and see the state of the world, we should be mournful. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, who want the world to be right, relationships to be right. That's the justice of God that's going to bring that about. That's what Jesus is talking about. Thank you. Done for real this time.